in this video, I kind of want to continue some of the conversation that I was having about Baudrillard before. We've been talking a little bit about Jean Baudrillard and a little bit about some of the ideas that he had and how they were pertinent to debate and the ways in which you can kind of use some of the different arguments that he's presented in debate and arguments that you read, especially if you're going for Baudrillard on the negative. And so I kind of want to continue along that line of videos and talk about the ways in which I think Baudrillard can be used on the negative for other parts of the flow. We kind of ended the last video talking a little bit about some of the pros and cons of reading Baudrillard and kind of like how thesis reliant I think it is in terms of being able to win really one central claim about the way in which like information operates, the way in which like we think about signs and signifiers. And so I think I'm going to kind of like stretch some of those kind of like thoughts that I've had in the previous video and the introduction to Baudrillard into some of this video now. Of course, if you haven't seen either of those videos, I would definitely go check that out now because it's like necessary context for some of the stuff that I think that we're talking about here, and I think that's particularly important. But I also think that if you're trying to like beat Baudrillard, this is like a very good place to start to kind of understand where the places that you really need to focus in on, and like can kind of help you when we start thinking about like policy responses to Baudrillard, etc. For this particular video, I think I'm just going to end up by talking about like the link debate, the permutation, impact comparison, and the alternative, and using that in order to frame what I think are some of the central questions that each of these portions of the flow really make pertinent for Baudrillard, and I think how some of the critiques that he's kind of made and that I've talked about in other places might connect to these parts of the flow, which I think that are particularly pertinent. So for the link debate, I think that on the link debate, the best place that you can start if you're a team that's going for Baudrillard is really just thinking about the 1AC as a source of representation. How does the 1AC justify itself, and why is that justification seen as one that is optimal? So like for instance, if you're reading affirmative, you're just like, what is it that is supposed to make someone supposed to vote for this affirmative? Is it the fact that if they don't vote for this affirmative that nuclear war is possible? Is it the fact that if you don't vote for the 1AC, economic collapse is possible? Is it the fact that the 1AC just does something for a group that has like had structural injustice as part of their community for a long time? Baudrillard, I think, asks a lot of these questions in terms of like what the purpose in which particular types of representation serve, and I think those particular types of arguments are really good as like arguments for the types of policy arguments you would want to read Baudrillard against. I think reading arguments that make critiques of the types of politics that are created in a world where we're able to continually justify politics along the same lines as the affirmative is really where you want to start making some of your kind of like impact articulation for why representation matters. Making arguments about how representation becomes a way that like public memory transfers and becomes the way in which we think about and accumulate various histories and then like create and react to our present based off of those histories, and try to think about a way in which like political decision making and the way that we think about like how political decision making is represented becomes kind of like informed via the types of representation that the 1AC is offering. And I think in that sense, if you're able to connect those to other types of like outside examples or analogies, then you have a really good place to kind of like start off a really comfortable force in the debate. I think that also additionally a lot of like arguments that I think are really good are ones that really beg the question of like what, especially against like soft left affirmatives, that kind of beg the question of like why isolate the particular communities they do. Obviously there's kind of like historical injustices that are related to a lot of the ways in which teams are trying to resolve structural injustice to like various soft leftist affirmatives, but I think when you're kind of like formulating your link argument in the context of Baudrillard for those arguments, looking at like some of the arguments that he's made on charity cannibalism can be extremely good in terms of thinking about how various sources of like thinking about the law as a place to do good, or thinking about the redeployment of resources in the context of like maybe something right on the water topic could be a place where I think Baudrillard really takes up like a problem with the types of politics that are created when we only think about the ability to like think about who should be politically represented via their suffering, and the way in which that makes it like a lot harder for us to think about a world where that suffering isn't necessary in order to make like politics workable. Additionally, I think that in the context of the permutation form of the debate, this is the portion of the debate where I think like Baudrillard teams like have the most fun and are really good at like beating back a lot of like the policy affirmatives, and one of the places I think is really strong for this criticism, because I think it makes a really strong reason about why the way in which we think about politics particularly doesn't allow us to actually move outside of the kind of like system of signs and signifiers that he is forwarding. And I think that when you kind of like think about there being kind of like no outside, to this necessary system, then there are a lot of reasons why any permutation that would attempt to like recuperate that system would only reinvest into a lot of the link arguments that you're making above. A lot of times I think when teams are losing these permutation arguments as Baudrillard teams, it's because they're already having trouble like above really justifying their thesis level argument and thinking about the way in which that thesis level argument is really able to apply to a variety level context and make sense in the context of the 1AC in particular, which is usually supplemented by some of the link tips that I gave above. But I think really in the context of the permutation, the place that you want to focus in on is really like playing around with the way in which the permutation kind of allows an infinite kind of like absorption of like whatever alternative or radical strategy that is put in front of it. I think there are a lot of arguments for like that Baudrillard can make in the line of like how like institutions kind of continually subsume radicality through the ability to kind of like come off as conclusive, and as they're breaking away from like the content of the kind of like way in which those institutions operate, but the actual form or the mechanism or the way in which those institutions are supposed to be moving does it actually change. And I think that this might have a lot to do also with the impact comparison portion of the flow, considering that the impact portion of the flow is really meant to indict the form of how we evaluate or think about what types of lives are marked as valuable or as invaluable. Impact comparison, I think, on these arguments is particularly important because I think that it allows you to really think about the various ways that we use and try to like justify like various forms of death and our fear of death as a way to like produce different types of policies. I really think Baudrillard is good for indicting the fear of death as one in which produces various representations of how we think about death that translate into politics and that inform various ways that we take up ourselves in the world, and that is kind of meant to recuperate the world as we know it. I think being able to kind of like blend and implement some of these kind of critiques of like utilitarianism or the way that we calculate life can really start off a really good impact turn to the way in which the 1AC wants to start like really weighing their impacts in a way that can be like really persuasive. And I think is a place where you really want to put in a lot of time to kind of like make the thesis arguments that you're making about how even the information and perspectives that we're gathering about like how we come to value life doesn't really make sense in the context of the critique that you're making, because of the way that it debunks like that there can be this kind of like static or like solid interpretation of how we should go about producing and making decisions considering all of the other factors that are produced in the world of science signifiers, etc. And hopefully in that context you'll be able to really think about a criticism of their impact comparison that kind of stretches itself a bit more. I think on the alternative basis, this is a place where I think Baudrillard teams struggle a little bit, but also kind of like try to lower their standard a lot using their thesis and framework work by creating a world where they only want to win that the 1AC is not different from the status quo, or that it invests in the type, in the form of status quo that the thesis is really pushing. Then I think that the alternative has a really low threshold, i.e. you can read things like refusal or just an argument about how we should kind of like push ourselves further into the simulation, etc., or arguments about acceleration. All have really interesting in routes to this, but I don't think that you have to do too much on the alternative, considering the way in which it all kind of flows from whether or not you win the thesis, which is going to inform your offense and therefore maybe like lower the amount of solvency arguments that you need to make, because if nothing else you can at least win that there's no value to the 1AC and kind of go closer towards something that would look like presumption. But you can do that in the framing of refusal as like how you're reading the alternative from the 1AC. And I think from that lens you really want to kind of push the other offensive portion of the debate and set the debate less around like the alternative actually being able to produce something outside of the types of things that you're indicting. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll keep tuning into the Baudrillard series. Thank you for coming in, and hopefully you'll come in for the next one.